So the notion of creativity, of course, is linked to the idea of originality, to this idea of generating something that's new, that's original in some sense, new knowledge, new approaches, new images. And we place this high value on creativity because it's at the very core of the modernist project, really. And the specific notion, I think, of creativity that's in play here is a distinctively romantic notion, and one that has been in the DNA of the research university from the very start in the 19th century. So that's part of our culture. It's part of an inherent ethical system we have here. Creativity is an inherent good, particularly creativity in research. That whatever our discipline, our goal in a major research university, as opposed to, say, a technical school or professional college, is to make a contribution, a creative contribution, something distinctive, to make a mark in some way. So given that deep link between research and the very notion of research and the notion of creativity, that's led me to think a lot about the role of the arts in a research university, as opposed to, say, the role of arts in a technical school. The arts as it's conceived, say, in SCAD. You might have exactly the same programs, but how is it positioned here? What is our charge, both in teaching and in doing research? And I think it's first of all, useful and fascinating for me always to think about the connection between what creativity and creative research means within different disciplines and between different disciplines. So creativity in the sciences as opposed to the humanities and the arts. And increasingly, I find those three conventional distinctions not very useful at all. So if you think within any of the disciplines, the difference between what constitutes creativity in philosophy, say, not to mention in continental philosophy versus analytic philosophy, or in history, or in literary theory, or in theoretical physics, as opposed to in mathematics, as opposed to biology. There are all of these really close connections between all these very disparate disciplines and huge differences within them. Even, say, within as narrow an arts discipline as theater, the work that a scenic designer does is going to have a lot more in common with the work of an architect or the work of a sculptor than the work of an actor, and certainly than the work of the theater historian. And then, of course, connections there as well.
I want to sort of sketch out a couple big questions that I'd be interested in hearing people talk about. One is, I think we should note that there's a whole other conversation going on, literally right now, amongst an interdisciplinary collection of students and faculty called the Creativity Research Group. And so there are people who are addressing creativity and studying creativity in a very scientific fashion. Right now they're having a drum circle with Dr. Arvind Scott. So there's an incredible kind of rigorous activity going on examining creativity here already. And I think one of the sort of problems here to explore is in some ways a messaging issue. And so, for example, I'd really like to hear people talk about creative research. I don't really understand what that means. I don't understand that term. And you get kind of mixed messages on this when you examine some of the literature, say, around OVPR definitions and even some of the guidelines for promotion and tenure that a lot of people look to for guidance. The other thing I wanted to point out is that there's some really incredible research going on outside UGA, in particular a fellow named Stephen Tepper at Vanderbilt. And I actually made photocopies of one of his articles here, if anyone wants to grab those. And he's been doing surveys and studies of the impact of creativity and helping people develop public policy. But he notes that in a survey of undergraduates, 4/5 of art majors say that creativity is typically required in their courses, compared with only 3% of biology majors, 16% of economics and business majors, 13% of engineers, and 10% of physical science majors. And I think that those statistics alone are you know, a great topic for conversation and some problem solving amongst faculty and students to figure out how we can create more value and recognition of the role of creativity in everything we do in a research university.
And I think in academia, you talked about originality. I think we often elide creativity and originality. And I think elide is better than to say confuse, because I don't actually think we confuse them. I think we just sort of layer them on top of each other. And so for me, even though they're related, they're not the same thing. The first one, creativity, for me involves process. And the second one involves product. And it seems to me unlikely, although it seems unlikely that originality can be produced without creativity, the resulting original product doesn't necessarily need to itself to be overtly creative or visibly creative. So that first book, for example, which I hope is innovative and original, to me is not a particularly creative, obviously creative text. It does new things, but it does it in a pretty conventional format. And to my view, it's more documentary and analytical than it is discursive or generative. But the innovation in it was the result of a creative process. The second book, though, is a much more visibly creative product. It's more discursive, it's open-ended, and part of my project is to actively seek to incite inquiry and, I guess, processes of becoming, right, in the people who read it. So I don't mean to imply that there should be a hierarchy here between originality and creativity, only to say that the latter, originality, is dependent, right, on the former, whether or not the creativity itself is visible in the final product, right? It's always sort of there. And I think that's really important for us to remember in the academy, because we place so much value on originality and innovation, but we often fail to promote and protect the conditions that are necessary to foster that kind of becoming, right? And I think your stats on creativity among students are kind of terrifying. And when I was thinking about the roundtable today, I noticed that the creative processes in my own work don't just generate artifacts, right? Not just books and articles, but they also generate what I guess we could call maybe the cultural diplomacy of research. Things like collaboration, intellectual exchange, cross-cultural understandings, the very kinds of things, the very kinds of globally and socially engaged epistemologies, right, that universities are increasingly recognizing that we should be engaged in. And so that, you know, if I kind of had this aha moment today, like thinking about that, was really recognizing how there is this other product, right, that's even often more invisible than the processes themselves, which is the other kinds of products that are being generated out there.
First of all, when my students come to me, I was like, well, I'm a really creative person, and this is why I want to do arts, because, you know, here, look at my sketchbook. I have hundreds and hundreds of ideas. And then when I tell them, well, my idea is that, you know, a dozen ideas a dime, right? I mean, it's not when you have an idea, it's when you start to try to make these ideas become realized and the problems you run into, and that's where your creativity starts. And to a certain extent, I see a parallel there with maybe other fields other than the arts, where you try to design a car, or you want to jump out of a hot air balloon really high and set a world record. Anyway, one of my teachers, the last time I was a student, a very old fellow, an animator, Jules Engel, who animated the mushroom sequence in Fantasia. That might tell you something about him, I don't know. But he said after teaching for, I don't know how long, he was in his mid-90s when he told me that. It was like, I see my main job as trying to stay away from the students as much as I can so they can let their creativity come out. I'll try to protect them a little bit, but I'm not trying to tell them, well, this works and that doesn't work. You go and figure it out. And the only job that I have is create a place, an institute, maybe even a research institute, where you can explore your own creativity. And my job is to give you a little bit of room to do that, not to tell you what works or what doesn't work.
You may disagree with my analysis of this, but I think partly, and we'll wrap up in a minute or two now, but partly it's to do with the economy in the last probably 10 to 15 years, that the university has flattened and broadened. I think it's been described as, rather than deepened. And perhaps part of the challenge into the future is to think about some core pillars, perhaps you conceive of them as questions, that we could ask, that we could think might be contemporary to the people in University of Georgia, the state, the region, the world to which it connects, the many advantages and resources that it has, and actually I'm very optimistic about the resources and advantages it has, and to think about if we could conceive of those moments as big questions, would it not only differentiate us as a university, but might prompt, challenge, provoke some of those collaborations that you're talking about? Because I think you're right that they're not just soft things that we do because they're nice. They're things that really drive the life of the mind, and in the end, it's the life of the mind that makes a great university.